Hey guys, welcome back with everything that's going on. So I wanted to cover some stuff this week so that we have a direction that we can head. I will talk about the assignment that will be next, and I will put that on Blackboard and put a due date on that. I haven't decided when that'll be, but I'll make sure that that's posted and things like that. So for our next assignment, though, it's going to be another posing assignment. But I want you to take some of the skills that we talked about last time with our weights and physics and making sure that our center of gravity and things like that are over our base of support. But I wanted to talk to you guys about a few more things so that you can start to apply a couple additional things to your posing when you're creating poses, right? Because if we come back to our 12 principles, pose to pose is how we are most often going to do our animations. Not that there's not times for straight ahead, but we are going to do pose to pose most of the time. And so it's really important that we know how to make good poses. So let's talk about a couple additional things. So again, pose to pose is one of the 12 principles of animation. And part of that foundation of pose to pose is the actual poses. So we want to make sure that we can come up with strong dynamic character poses. And so we need to break down creating a pose into the foundations of then what goes into making a pose, right? If a pose is a foundation of our animation, well, we can break that down even more and look at, well, what goes into making a good pose. And we've talked about that a little bit already as far as, exaggeration, squash and stretch, and that sort of stuff can help emphasize our characters' poses. And we've also talked about weights and physics and things like that. But I do want to talk about a few other things. So, where to start? So, we will get into the character performance side of things a little bit more in animation 2. But I do want you guys to start thinking a little bit along those lines. So, number one, I want you to take a second and think about the character. Like, who is this character, right? And that was part of the purpose of the elevator assignment, was for you to think about that character and how they would respond to a situation, and then build poses based off of that character and that situation. Okay, so that's really important. And so, one, we need to think about their internal things, but we also need to start at thinking about their physicality, right? Are there any disabilities? What is their typical posture? What is their occupation, right? Because that can help direct how they would respond in a situation. And just to think in regards to their physical, are they, a big beefy guy, a long skinny girl, whatever the case may be, we need to think about that because that could affect how they interact with their environment, right? If we have a character that's short and stubby, they're going to have a hard time running and jumping over things, right? And so that could affect their poses. So it's really important to take a second and think about the character and then also the situation that you're trying to animate them through. Okay, number 2, action. So what is the character doing, right? It's a good idea to ask yourself that question. Are they in the middle of an action? Are they in the beginning? So are they in the beginning, middle, or the end of doing something? And that can be really important as far as things like character motivation and things of that nature. If they've just entered somewhere, like say they walk into a room, it might be important to also think about, well, where did they just come from, right? So don't just have them walk in a room and shut a door, but why or what happened right before they walked in that door? Were they, chased by a pack of dogs? The way they come in and close the door, that pose could be completely different based on how you answer that question. So it's really important to start asking yourself some things about character and the action and where the action is in the sequence of the whole animation. Also consider things, again, like weights and physics and all that sort of stuff, center of gravity and all those things that we previously talked about. Number 3, it's also really important to think about internal and external things. So what does your character believe? What are their motivations? What are their objectives, right? Those are going to direct their performance and their action, which can then manifest in their posing. Okay? So, for example, if we think about a character that needs to get a carton of milk, okay, at the grocery store, and we have them going to the grocery store, and they look and they see that there's only one carton of milk left, all right, and we see somebody else heading for that same carton of milk. The way that we're going to animate our character trying to overcome that obstacle of that one carton of milk being snatched before they can get it could be completely different than if the character comes in and there's like tons of milk, right? So it's important to ask yourself some questions again about what's going on inside internally. Are there any obstacles that's keeping them from their objectives, and what are they trying to do to overcome those obstacles? And then also, and this will be something that we talk more about in animation too. Well, all of this will, but the status in particular is going to be something that we talk about. There is a thing called status transactions, and that you could almost think of that as your interactions with, say, your boss, right? Which could be completely different than your interactions with, say, your kid or something like that, right? So the way you hold yourself, like if you're on duty and your boss is expecting you to be doing something, how you interact with them and how your character's poses are going to be addressed could be completely different, right? Or you could even take that to the nth degree, like maybe this is a kid meeting their superhero for the first time, and how would that kid's excitement manifest in their poses and things like that. So keep those things in mind too. So these are always good things to, when you're first creating your poses, to kind of go through and ask yourself some of these questions, because it can help direct where you're going to go with your posing. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is our previs or our layout. And this is essentially getting our character into the scene, right? So we want to get our character into the scene. We want to orient them into the direction. We can do maybe some rough initial poses, okay? But it's essentially getting them in there and getting the scene set up for you to move further with them, okay? The next thing that we want to consider are some things like power center. Again, we're going to talk a lot about Ed hooks and animation too, but there is a thing called power centers. And the way you can think about power centers is it's where your character's primary energy is going to emanate from. If you could take an invisible string and pull your character, let's say that they're really proud and they're really puffed up and their chest is expanding, right? You can almost attach an invisible string to the character's chest and pull upwards, right? Because you can see that pride kind of welling up in their chest, okay? So, and that power center can be anywhere in the body or even outside of the body, right? If somebody's super sad and super depressed and they're leaning over crying or something like that, that power center could be out in front of them or towards the ground or something like that, like it's just pulling them down. Okay, now typically speaking, our power centers, just for most people, are going to be right above the belly button, somewhere in there. But that can change depending on who your character is and some of those things, their physical stature, or also some internal things. All that sort of stuff can affect where the power center is. So in this example, we can see like the power center is right above her belly button. Okay, that's her power center. The next thing we want to think about is line of action. And so this, you can think of this as a gesture that has a nice curvy flow line to it, okay? And this should be the gesture of your character's body, okay? And so a lot of times it's not a bad idea to think about the line of action before you even start posing your character. Um, one thing to consider, if your line of action is super straight, it's going to be a very boring pose. So you want to give some curve to this so that it'll give your character some nice dynamic in their posing. And you can typically think that as far as where the line of action goes, typically starts at the head, or it could even be down at the feet, and it goes through the body, and it's the gesture of the entire body. And it also follows, you could think, in regards to the spine or the spinal column, right? As it gets into your character's center, right? That would follow or the spine would follow that line of action. Okay, but if this is super boring and there's no curvature to the line of action, a lot of times the poses won't look very interesting. Again, this is all about creating fun and interesting animations, and so we need to understand the building blocks of how we do that. And this is one of those things. This right here can be extremely helpful when trying to come up with nice, good poses. So really think about this. Power centers can too, and again, we'll talk more about that later. All right, let's move on. Okay, so we've talked about physics a little bit, like weight, the center of gravity, and that being over our base of support. And just kind of as a quick refresher, so 1 foot, if she's standing on 1 foot, the base of support would be just around that 1 foot. But if you have 2 feet on the ground, or or animal with 4 legs or something like that, you want to draw a box around all the feet that are or hands or whatever that are on the ground. Okay, and so since she's a biped, she has 2 legs. We can draw a box around her feet, and this whole area is her base of support. Okay, and then if we can imagine where that center of gravity is, and if we draw a line straight down from it, as long as it's over the base of support, she is in balance and she's not going to fall. Again, we've talked about this. We went in pretty big detail and covered a lot of stuff, but just really keep this in mind, right? Okay, the other thing that we want to really consider, and I know I'm going to butcher this, but is the contrapposto. Okay, and what is this? This is in regards to our hips and our shoulders, and also sometimes the knees. So like if you go and you look at the statue of David or different famous sculptures and things like that, a lot of times you'll see this in play just all over the place to create interesting and dynamic poses. And one way that you can think of this is that they're countering angles, right? So if I bend the hips this way, right? So this side of the hip comes down and this side of the hip goes up. We could draw a line through that, and now we have this angle. We would not want our shoulders to have that same angle, because she would just be bending over, and it'll look very droopy and not very interesting. Or even if this was just straight, it wouldn't look very interesting. So what you want to do a lot of times, if you tilt your hips to one direction, and you should really consider that, is you should then tilt your shoulders in the opposite direction, right? So if we can draw these lines, you'll see that these lines will intersect each other, right? So we want these to counter one another, and so this can help your poses look interesting, and again, just help them be a little more dynamic. Again, you could almost see the line of action, right? In this sort of stuff too. Okay, so a lot of this goes hand in hand, but you want to really think about this, right? And then also line of action and that sort of stuff, while also still considering center of gravity and base of support. Okay, another thing to really consider are the flow lines. Flow lines are going to help guide the viewer's eyes towards where you intend them. Okay, so right here in this pose, for example, the energy is all going over here, right? If we look at her arm, it's pointing this way. Her eyes are going this way. The way the leg is pointing, the foot, the knee, that foot, all of this is directing energy over here. And that's going to be something really important too, right? Because we want to remember things like staging and performance and where our character is and move energy across a screen, which that does also bring us to staging, right? So if she's here and she's focusing her energy across the screen, we want to make sure that she's in the thirds, right? And so I drew this little line right here to illustrate like over here in the thirds and that sort of thing. So she's been posed like on the thirds, and this can help with staging. Another thing that can really help with staging as well is trying to do a little bit of depth with your poses. And so here we can see our character's legs are coming towards the camera, like this is coming a little towards the camera, and this is going off and back into our 3D depth, right? And so that can also be helpful with posing as well. Another thing to consider with staging is our camera angles, right? And so these little yellow arrows are kind of illustrating that this camera is low and looking up, right? So we can see like the curvature of like the text back here, but we're also looking at her. She's got this really powerful stance, and we've also put the camera low, which also helps emanate that power and her energy that is flowing across the screen. Okay. We also want to think about some things to build contrast. And so what I did here was to illustrate Silhouette was I shaded her like a pinkish color so that you could kind of get a sense. And so what Silhouette is it's really like the outline of the character, right? And so if you're posing your characters, the overall shape should have some interest to it, right? And be dynamic and kind of move all over, right? And so it's not just very blocky, staying in one, simple shape, right? You want to create these dynamic shapes that change. Like if you start to outline it, your pencil or your pen or whatever would really kind of go all over the place, tracing the interesting outline in the shape. So consider that. Silhouette can be really important and can also help with creating some very interesting and dynamic poses. Now, another thing to consider as well is positive and negative space. So, right, just the space that she is filling is going to be positive. But then there's also use of negative space, right? Almost kind of like holes that you can kind of like cut through or something like this. So this negative space, if you can incorporate that at times, can be really interesting and also assist in creating some interesting poses. Another thing to consider, straight lines and curves. So you don't want everything to be like a straight line, right, and very angular. You want to have, or even just super curvy, right? You want it to be dynamic, right? So where there's a contrast, right, where you have some straight lines, but then you also have this flow and curve. Like again, if we did our line of action, she has some really interesting line of action, right? We still get this nice little curvature S shape, but even within that, we still have some really nice straight lines, and then we also have some curved movements, right? So we want to create and have a contrast where we try to do both of that, so to speak. So the line of action, you should again always have some curvature in that, but think about some areas like this where if you can have some straight lines to add a little bit of contrast, that could really help the dynamic level of your poses. And so again, this section is all about contrast, right? Trying to combine some different things to like positive and negative and straight lines and curves and things like that, just to, again, if you can contrast it, it's going to look interesting, and there's going to be some differences that just help that interest level. All right, so let's move on. So let's talk about a couple things that you should try to avoid. One thing that you should try to avoid is twinning, okay? And what is twinning? So twinning is going to be if you could take one side of her body and mirror it over to the other side, that's what it is, right? So this arm is doing the exact same thing as this arm. And that's not very dynamic. That's not very interesting. So this is a term that's referred to as twinning. So if I could cut her in half and then just mirror this side over to this side, they're pretty similar, right? And so there's not a lot of contrast. There's not that you can never do it, but you should avoid it as much as possible. And the times that you would do it would be like to really emphasize something. Like if somebody just won a big prize and they throw their arms up in the air to celebrate, then that could be a nice moment to utilize twinning. Most of the time you want to avoid it, but there are a few times. Or maybe your character is a magician and they're casting a spell and both of their arms go out to do that. That could be an okay time, but most of the time you want to avoid this. Another thing that you want to do is you want to try to avoid profile angles, okay? So you don't want her facing directly at the screen, right? Or even to the side, almost like if you think of mug shots, right, where they have somebody face the camera and then face directly to the side of the camera. You want to avoid things like that as much as possible, right? So you want to have them at angles. The other thing, and I might have not mentioned this, but I know it's in here somewhere. Another thing that you want to avoid is avoid having your characters back to the camera, right? So we want them facing forward. We just don't want them facing like directly forward in a profile. Or they can be facing the side, but not directly to the side. Typically speaking, unless we absolutely have to and there's a reason for it, we don't want to see the characters back as much, okay? Unless there's a really good reason for it, like maybe Spider-Man swinging through the city and the camera is behind him or something like that, you know. There are times for it, but most of the time you want to avoid those types of things. Okay, so let's talk about your assignment. So finish up your elevator posing assignments. That is on Blackboard. That has a due date. I don't have that right in front of me right now, so I don't remember, but double check that. I believe I pushed that right after spring break. I think that was due the Wednesday that you guys get back, but double check that on Blackboard. That's kind of what I'm thinking it is, but I put it on there. It's already been posted, so double check that. This will likely be due either a week or a week and a half out from that, like maybe that the following Friday or something like that. I'll make a decision though on that and get that posted on Blackboard. So keep an eye on Blackboard for that too, right? So what is the next assignment? So the next assignment is I'm going to want you to create 6 poses, okay? And we'll kind of go into those in regards to what those poses are going to be in the next slides. But essentially there's going to be 6 poses that I want you to create. Again, just like the elevator assignment, I want you to do a screen grab, and then I want you to copy that. Take that screen grab, copy it, and then paste it into a Word document, right? So your Word document should have your 6 poses in the Word document, and then you will submit your Word document in Blackboard, okay? Okay, so what your assignment is going to be, you're going to create, okay, 6 total poses. They're going to be broken down into 3 and 3. So your first set of 3 poses are going to be a character lifting a heavy object, okay? And then the next 3 are going to be your character lifting a light object. So I want you to take things into consideration that we talked about, and specifically the weight and physics, right, that we talked about right before break. Okay, so I want to see you employ where you're thinking about things like center of gravity and making sure that center of gravity is directly over your character's base of support. Now, again, like we talked before, and I'll go ahead and move to the next slide. So I've got this girl lifting this water jug. So if you guys remember, she has her center of gravity, which is right around her belly button. This has its center of gravity, and so if the object is super heavy, there's going to be a new center of gravity, not in the middle of this, not in the middle of her, but it's going to be somewhere in between. If it's super light, it's not going to pull the center of gravity off her very much. But if it's heavy, that new center of gravity is going to gravitate more towards the center of this heavy object. So in this situation, right, we have center of gravity here, we have center of gravity here. But in this final pose, we're going to have a new center of gravity that is somewhere in between. And because this is heavy, it's really pulled the new center of gravity maybe somewhere, not in the middle, but maybe somewhere like right here. And so if we draw a line straight down from that, that should be over her base of support. So think about posing your feet. Think about making sure that your character is leaning back if this is super heavy, to make sure that that new center of gravity maintains over the base of support. Now that's going to change if this object is light. So in this example that I showed you real quick, and this is what I'm going to want to see from you guys, is a progression, right? So 3 poses where there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. So that's essentially what I'm going to want to see, right? Your character beginning to lift the heavy object, your character maybe in the middle of it, and I could have had her maybe at a more midpoint, but you kind of get the point, right? And then the final pose, right? And you can see she's leaning back so that this new center of gravity maintains its place over her base of support. Now, a light object, right, is going to have a center of gravity here, center of gravity here, but as she starts to stand up, that new center of gravity, because this ball is so light, is not really going to move very much. In fact, it might shift barely, but it's not a big deal. And so she can stand here and not have to lean over or lean backwards as much, right? And she can also maintain these straight arms, right? So she can hold that ball way out really far because her center of gravity is still here. And you can, as you notice, I didn't really have to adjust her base of support to make it bigger so that she would maintain in balance. So again, 3 poses, beginning, middle, end of lifting a heavy object, beginning, middle, end of lifting a light object. And so essentially this is your assignment. Create 3 poses, paste those images into Blackboard and or into a Word document, and then submit that Word document into Blackboard for your assignment as soon as I get that posted, and you'll be good. So at this point, I think we're good. I'm going to maintain conversations on Discord. So if you have any questions or anything like that, shoot me a message. Also, if you prefer email too, I'm going to still be checking email, right? So I'm going to try to communicate both through email and also through Discord. So if you have any questions or anything like that, let me know. Shoot me an email or post something in Discord, and I'll try to answer it. Using Discord is not a bad idea though, because if you have a question, that probably means there's like 5 or 6 other people that have the same question, right? So if you pose a question in Discord and I answer it there, it could answer like several questions for a lot of people. So not that I won't answer through email, that's fine. Or if you just want to send me a message, a personal message in Discord, that's fine too. But that's just something else to consider. So, all right, well, welcome back. Work on this. Again, let me know if you have any questions. But hopefully this has been helpful, and I'll get that assignment posted onto Blackboard.